The sound of shattering porcelain cut through the morning quiet of the mansion like a sentence being ended before it was finished. Ngozi's hands were still damp from the kitchen when she heard her madam's voice come down the corridor with the particular sharpness of a blade that has been sharpened so many times its edge has become something personal. "Ngozi. Get in here. Now." She dried her hands on her apron and moved quickly, her old slippers whispering against the polished floor. Her madam was standing in the sitting room with her arms folded and a broken decorative bowl at her feet, water spreading slowly across the imported marble, the small white flowers that had been arranged inside it now scattered and broken looking on the expensive floor. "Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. What would you do if the person who had spent months making your life small, who had talked to you like you were less than the furniture you were paid to dust, was suddenly lying helpless and the one thing standing between her and death was something only you possessed? Would you use it? Would you walk away? Would you hesitate? Hold that question in your chest while this story unfolds, because by the end of it, the answer is going to mean something different to you than it does right now. Stay with me. Welcome to Bishop Tales, where every week we bring you powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories that stay with you long after the video ends. If you are new here, please subscribe right now and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from tonight. Are you in Nigeria, Ghana, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, South Africa, Jamaica, or somewhere else in this world? We love knowing where our family is. Now let us begin. Her name was Ngozi Ibe and she was 19 years old. She had come to Lagos from Awka 11 months ago with one bag that contained everything she owned and a heart full of the particular hope that young people carry when they are leaving a place that has not been able to offer them enough and heading toward a city that has promised, through the stories of everyone who has ever gone before them, that it will. Her father was a retired primary school teacher whose pension arrived late and insufficient. Her mother sold provisions from a small shop attached to the front of their house. There were 4 younger children behind Ngozi whose school fees and feeding and futures were a calculation that the family revisited every single month. Ngozi had come to Lagos because staying in Awka meant watching that calculation get harder every year. She had come because a woman in their church had a connection to a domestic placement service. She had come because she was the eldest, and that is what eldest daughters do when the family needs something done. The placement service had arranged her position in the Bassi household within 2 weeks. The house was in Lekki, gated, enormous, the kind of property that Ngozi had only seen in the backgrounds of photographs on people's phones. 26 rooms. A swimming pool. A kitchen the size of the entire ground floor of her family's house in Awka. She had stood at the gate on the first morning and felt something that was equal parts awe and the specific anxiety of a person who has just arrived somewhere that is designed to remind them of what they do not have. Her madam's name was Sonia Bassi. She was 44 years old, the wife of Emmanuel Bassi, who had built his fortune in oil and gas infrastructure over 20 years of work that had made him one of the more significant figures in that industry and which had also made him the kind of man who was frequently absent from his own household, away on business or on travel or in the Lagos traffic that consumed hours of every day, which meant that the mansion and its staff operated largely under Sonia's governance and Sonia governed. With the comprehensive authority of someone who has decided that the space she controls is a direct reflection of who she is and who therefore cannot tolerate anything in it that falls short of her precise and frequently shifting standards. Sonia was not cruel in the way of people who enjoy cruelty. She was cruel in the way that is harder to name and therefore harder to address, the way of people who have never been required to consider the interior experience of someone who serves them and who therefore speak and act without the filter that consideration would provide. She called Ngozi to her with the same tone she used for the household dogs. She sent her back to redo work that had been done correctly because the redoing communicated something about the hierarchy of the house that Sonia required to be communicated. She made comments about Ngozi's background, her accent, her village, the way she held things, the way she moved, comments that were delivered with the casual ease of someone who does not understand that words are landing because they have never been on the receiving end of words delivered from above. Ngozi had arrived in Lagos with hope and had found this. She had told herself in the first 3 months that it was temporary. She had told herself she was learning the city, building the reference, sending money home, and that the difficulty of the environment was the cost of the progress. She had written letters to her mother that described the house in terms of its size and none of its terms of its atmosphere. She had kept her head down and her work careful and her voice quiet, and she had endured because endurance was something she had grown up watching her parents practice, and she had learned it from them the way children learn the things their parents do constantly, without being taught, simply by being present for it. On the morning the bowl broke, Ngozi had arranged it on the coffee table at the start of the day. She had positioned it carefully, measured the distance from the edges with the instinct of someone who has been corrected enough times about placement that placement has become a precise and anxious activity. The bowl had been in the center of the table. She knew it had been in the center. But Sonia stood over the pieces on the floor and said she had placed it too close to the edge and that it had fallen when she barely brushed against the table in passing. Ngozi said nothing. She had learned very quickly that the version of events that mattered in this house was the version Sonia produced, and that producing a competing version cost more than it returned. She said she was sorry and went for the mop. Sonia stepped over the broken pieces in her house shoes and said the bowl had cost more than Ngozi would earn in 6 months, and that sorry was a word that required effort to say and produced nothing of value, and that she expected the floor to show no mark of what had happened by the time she came back through. Then she left, her perfume remaining in the room after her like the aftermath of a verdict. Ngozi knelt on the cold marble and picked up the pieces one by one and thought about her mother and thought about Akka and thought about her youngest brother who wanted to be an engineer and who would need school fees and examination fees and the kind of sustained investment that a maid's salary sent home in careful portions was trying to provide. She picked up the pieces. She cleaned the floor. She moved to the next task. From his home office on the upper floor Emmanuel Bassi was reviewing contracts and had heard none of it. At 48 he had the particular quality of a man who has built something significant and is still building, and who has organized his domestic life to run independently of his attention because his attention is required elsewhere. He was not indifferent to his wife or to the household. He was occupied, which in the specific grammar of wealthy busy men is sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. He had noticed, in the margin of his attention, that Sonia was hard on the staff. He had noticed the turnover, the way new faces appeared and old ones disappeared. He had told himself Sonia had high standards and high standards were not a character flaw, and that the management of the domestic staff was her domain the way the management of the business was his. He had told himself these things and had continued being occupied. Ngozi moved through the day. She prepared Sonia's mid-morning tea at the correct temperature and in the correct cup and on the correct tray with the correct biscuit, and carried it to wherever Sonia was, and received either silence or a minor criticism depending on what aspect of the offering caught Sonia's attention. She prepared lunch to the precise specifications that had been communicated to her across weeks of refinement, specifications that shifted slightly from week to week in ways that seemed designed to ensure that perfection was always just beyond reach. She ironed. She swept. She polished the surfaces of a house that contained more beautiful things than she had known existed and attended to each of them with the care of someone who understands that the value of the things she is responsible for is many times the value of herself in this household's accounting. She moved through it all like weather, present and necessary and unacknowledged. The other 2 staff members in the house, a cook named Mrs. Fashola and a driver named Emika, were cordial to her in the careful way of people who have assessed the household's politics and decided that proximity to its least favored member was not an investment they were prepared to make. They were not unkind. They were simply cautious in the way that people are cautious when they have calculated the cost of association and found it too high. What no one in the house knew yet was that the last ordinary day was already underway. The day that would end the familiar pattern and begin something none of them had seen coming. Now friends, before we go any further I want to stop here and ask you to like this video right now and drop a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from and tell us this: have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between your hurt and someone else's need? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now, because what happens next in this story is going to challenge you in ways you are not expecting, and you need to be here for all of it. Sonia's headache began on a Tuesday afternoon. She mentioned it to no one, the way people who do not allow themselves to be perceived as anything other than completely functional do not mention the small signals their bodies send. She took something from the medicine cabinet and continued with her afternoon. By evening the headache had become something else, a heaviness that had moved from behind her eyes into her neck and shoulders and down into her back, and her skin had taken on the specific quality of something that was both too hot and too cold simultaneously in a way that did not resolve when she added or removed clothing. She asked Ngozi for paracetamol when she came through the front door at 6. Ngozi brought it with a glass of water and a cold cloth without being asked for the cloth, simply because she had been raised in a house where you brought what someone needed before they knew they needed it. Sonia took the medicine without looking up. By midnight she was shaking under 2 blankets, and the temperature reading Emmanuel took with the thermometer from the bathroom cabinet was high enough that he called their doctor immediately and stood beside the bed with his hand on his wife's shoulder while she trembled and said she was cold in the voice of someone who sounds unfamiliar to themselves. The doctor came. He took readings and looked at the readings with the expression of a doctor who has seen many things and is not yet certain which category of thing this belongs to. He said the temperature was concerning. He said he wanted blood work done at first light. He said he was starting her on broad-spectrum antibiotics and that they should not wait to see how she responded before proceeding to the hospital. The hospital admitted her the following morning. Over the 3 days she was there they ran tests that covered every panel available to them, every scan that was relevant, every consult that could be arranged. The fever did not break. It sat at the same high position regardless of what was administered, as though it was not responding to the treatments but simply coexisting with them, which is the quality of a fever that produces a specific concern in the doctors managing it, because a fever that does not respond to treatment is a fever whose source has not yet been correctly identified. Specialists came. They offered possibilities in the careful language of people who are not yet certain enough to offer diagnoses. Autoimmune. Viral. Unknown tropical exposure. They adjusted medications. They ran more tests. Nothing moved. On the 5th day Emmanuel brought her home because the hospital had arrived at the limit of what further hospitalization could achieve without a diagnosis to treat. A private nurse was arranged. The house became quieter in the way that houses become quiet when the person who generated most of their noise is no longer generating it. Sonia lay upstairs and the downstairs continued on the reduced energy of a household operating carefully around something fragile. Ngozi prepared the meals that went upstairs on trays and came back down mostly untouched. She changed the bed linen with the gentle efficiency of someone who has learned to move around illness without disturbing it. She brought the medications on schedule. She did these things not because Sonia deserved her care, which was a thought she did not allow herself to hold for long, but because it was what the situation required, and Ngozi was a person who did what situations required. Her mother had taught her this. Her mother had taught her many things. She had also been taught something that she was not yet ready to say out loud. She had been 12 years old when it happened in their village. A neighbor, a woman called Mama Chabiz, had fallen ill with something that the clinic in the town could not address, a fever that held on for weeks, a grayness that came into the skin, a weakness that deepened progressively despite everything the clinic tried. It had been Ngozi's mother who had eventually gone to see Mama Chabiz. Not as a medical professional but as someone who understood certain things about certain kinds of illness that the clinic's training did not cover. Ngozi's mother was not a witch doctor. She was not a herbalist in the formal sense. She was a woman who had grown up in a lineage of women who understood that some illnesses live in the body and some illnesses live elsewhere, and that knowing the difference was the beginning of knowing how to address them. She had explained this to Ngozi when Ngozi was old enough to understand and young enough to receive it without the skepticism that education sometimes installs in people who grow up in cities. She had taught Ngozi what she knew, not systematically as a curriculum but naturally as a practice, the way women in that lineage had always transferred the knowledge, through watching and helping and the gradual absorption of things that cannot be written down because their power lives in the doing rather than the describing. Ngozi had watched Mama Chabiz recover in 3 days after her mother's intervention. She had watched the gray leave the skin and the fever release its hold and the strength return in increments. She had filed this knowledge in the specific place where things go that a person knows to be true but understands they cannot say in every room. Because Sonia was exactly the kind of person who would not receive it well. Ngozi had heard her once, during a lunch with 2 of her friends, describing a story about traditional healing practices with the specific laughter of a person who finds the idea primitive, who categorizes it alongside things that educated people do not believe, who would have looked at Ngozi saying, "I think I know what is wrong with your wife and I know how to address it," and would have heard in that sentence confirmation of every assumption she had ever made about the girl from Akka. So Ngozi said nothing. She carried the trays and changed the linen and administered the medications on schedule and watched Sonia become less of herself by degrees, and she said nothing, and part of her, a part she examined carefully and honestly in the evenings in her small room, understood that her silence was not only about self-protection. Part of it was the quiet and uncomfortable satisfaction of watching someone who had treated her carelessly encounter something that her carefulness could not manage. She examined this feeling without excusing it and carried it honestly alongside the other feelings, the ones that were simpler and more straightforward, the ones that simply said this woman is dying and you have been given something that might help. 2 weeks passed. Emmanuel brought in a specialist from Abuja and a diagnostician whose speciality was rare and unusual presentations of illness. They arrived on the same day, consulted together and separately with the private nurse, reviewed everything that had been tried, and left with the polite uncertainty of people whose expertise has reached its applicable limit. The bills in Emmanuel's office were becoming an archive of expense that was producing no result. He was spending money with the specific desperation of a person who has realized that money is not the instrument required for this particular problem but who has no other instrument to reach for. He was sitting in his study on a Wednesday afternoon when Ngozi knocked. She had brought tea because she had been raised to bring tea when she arrived at a door, because arriving empty-handed to a person who was suffering was something her mother had taught her was its own kind of carelessness. He did not answer the first knock. She knocked again. He said come in so quietly that she almost missed it. She opened the door. He was in his chair with his face in his hands and his shoulders doing the specific movement of a man who is crying in the way that men cry when they have been holding something for too long and the holding has finally exceeded what is available to hold it with. She stopped in the doorway with the tray in her hands and looked at him, this man who had barely spoken to her directly in 11 months, whose household had been the architecture of her daily difficulty, who was sitting in his expensive chair and weeping without sound because the one thing he could not build or buy or arrange was happening to his wife and there was nothing in his considerable resources that was addressing it. She set the tray down on the side table. She said, "Sir," quietly. He looked up quickly and wiped his face with the back of his hand and she saw the embarrassment cross his features, the reflexive shame of being seen in a state he had not chosen to show. She said she was sorry to interrupt. She said she had something she needed to tell him and she needed him to hear it properly before he responded to it. He stared at her. She took a breath. She said his wife's sickness was not responding to medicine because it was not the kind of sickness that medicine was designed for. She said she had seen this before. She said she knew how it sounded and she needed him to stay with her past the way it sounded because his wife was dying and everything else had already been tried. She told him about Mama Chabiz. She told him about her mother. She told him what she had been taught and what she had watched happen and what she believed she was looking at in the upstairs bedroom of this house. She said it quietly and clearly and without the performance of conviction because she did not need to perform what she actually felt. He was quiet when she finished. Then he asked her what her mother would do. She said her mother would prepare specific things and perform a specific ritual and that she had watched it enough times and helped with it enough times to attempt it, though she was not her mother and she could not promise what her mother could promise. He asked if she could try. She said she could try. He said try. She asked for a driver and for money and for the freedom to go to the market herself because the things she needed had to be chosen in person, had to be assessed by smell and by feel and by the specific knowledge of what she was looking for that could not be communicated to someone else to search on her behalf. He said take whatever you need. She came back in the late afternoon with a cloth bag that Mrs. Fashola eyed from the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who is uncertain what they are looking at and has not yet decided whether they want to know. Ngozi spread what she had brought on the kitchen table and worked through it with the focused attention of someone performing a task they have watched many times and are now performing for the first time without the safety of a more experienced presence beside them. She prepared a liquid in a specific sequence that her mother had rehearsed with her on visits home, boiling certain things and straining them and adding others at specific intervals and in specific amounts. The kitchen filled with a smell that was complex and sharp and earthy and entirely different from the kitchen's usual smells, and Mrs. Fashola quietly moved her preparation to the other end of the counter and said nothing. When the preparation was ready, Ngozi carried it upstairs. Emmanuel met her at the bedroom door. He looked at the cup in her hand. She explained what needed to happen that evening, that Sonia needed to take the preparation in small amounts and that afterward Ngozi needed to perform a cleansing in the room, a ritual involving specific things she had brought from the market, words she had been taught, actions she had watched her mother perform. She said she understood if he was not comfortable with it. He said do it. He said he would stay. They went into the room together. Sonia was unconscious, her breathing shallow and effortful, her face in the specific state of someone who has been fighting something for a long time and is running out of fighting. Her cheeks had the hollowness that comes from weight lost quickly. Her lips were dry. She looked, Ngozi thought, like someone standing very close to a threshold they were not yet supposed to cross. Ngozi said her name softly. She lifted her head gently and brought the cup to her lips and administered the preparation slowly and carefully, waiting between each small amount for Sonia's body to receive it, talking to her quietly in a voice that was meant to reach somewhere below the level of consciousness where intention could still be received. When enough had been given, she set the cup aside and prepared for the ritual. She lit the bundle of dried leaves she had prepared and let the smoke move through the room in the specific patterns her mother had shown her, around the body, above the head, through the corners of the space. She spoke the words she had been taught, old words, words that had been passed down through the women of her family's lineage for longer than anyone could accurately account for, words that her mother had made her learn by repetition until they were as automatic as breathing. She traced the signs her mother had shown her, drawn in the air above Sonia's body with the focused intentionality of someone who understands that intention is the engine of what she is doing and therefore cannot afford to perform it without full attention. Emmanuel stood against the wall the entire time. He did not understand what he was witnessing. He was a man who had built his life on things that could be measured and verified and contracted and delivered, and this was none of those things. But he stood against the wall and he watched this 19-year-old girl from Akka move around his wife's bed with a seriousness and a care that exceeded anything the specialists from Abuja had brought into the room, and he did not interrupt and he did not ask her to stop. She finished. She said it was done. She said they would know by morning whether the fever was breaking. She said if she had understood the signs correctly it would break before sunrise. He said thank you. She nodded and went back to her room. She did not sleep. She lay on her narrow bed in the staff quarters and looked at the ceiling and made peace with every possible outcome. She had done what she knew how to do with what she had been given. She had not done it because Sonia deserved it. She had done it because her mother had told her that the medicine did not know who deserved it and neither should the person administering it. She had done it because she was the person who had been placed in front of this particular need with this particular knowledge, and the placing of you in front of a need with the capacity to address it was in her mother's understanding a form of instruction. Emmanuel did not leave the bedroom. He sat in the chair beside the bed and watched his wife's chest rise and fall and counted the minutes and checked the temperature reading every half hour with a precision that was its own form of prayer. The nurse returned at 6 in the morning and looked at the readings and then looked at them again. She took a new reading with the thermometer. She took it again. She said the temperature had dropped significantly. She said it was approaching normal range. Her voice had the quality of someone reporting something they are not yet allowing themselves to fully believe. At 7:45 Sonia's eyes opened. Not with drama. Not suddenly. The way eyes open when consciousness returns from a long distance, gradually, the lids lifting slowly and then the focus arriving in stages. She looked at Emmanuel first. She said his name. He stood up so fast the chair scraped back across the floor. He said her name. He said she was awake. She said what happened and how long had it been and why did she feel like she had been somewhere very far away. He said 2.5 weeks. She said that was not possible. He said it was, and she was going to be all right and everything was going to be all right, and he held her hand with both of his and did not let go. By noon she was sitting up. By evening she was eating. The nurse, a professional who had managed many significant recoveries and had calibrated her responses accordingly, used the word extraordinary twice in the same conversation without catching herself. The doctor who came that evening looked at the chart and looked at Sonia and looked at the chart again and said he would need to review the blood work from that morning before he could explain what he was seeing. He never fully explained it. Some things, Ngozi thought, do not require the explanation in order for the change to be real. 3 days later Emmanuel told Sonia everything. He told her about Ngozi, about what she had said in the study, about the herbs and the preparation and the ritual, about Ngozi standing over her bed in the dark saying her name softly and asking her mother's knowledge to be enough. Sonia listened without speaking. Her hands were folded in her lap and her face was doing the specific work of a person receiving information that is requiring them to revise something fundamental. When he finished she asked where Ngozi was. He said downstairs. She asked him to bring her up. Ngozi came to the doorway of the bedroom with the particular wariness of someone who has been summoned to spaces where difficult things have happened before and is not certain what this summoning means. Sonia looked at her from the chair by the window. She said, "Come here." Ngozi came closer and stopped at the foot of the bed. Sonia said her husband had told her what had happened. She said he had told her what Ngozi had done. She was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding which of the many true things available to them is the one they most need to say first. She said she was sorry. She did not say it quickly. She said it in the voice of someone who has been thinking about what they need to say and has chosen the words carefully and means them in a way that goes beyond the word itself. She said she was sorry for every cruel word. For every impossible standard that moved the moment it was reached. For every comment about Ngozi's background and her village and her way of speaking and her way of moving. She said she had known while she was saying these things that they were unkind and she had said them anyway because she was afraid, though she had not understood what she was afraid of, and her fear had expressed itself as control and her control had expressed itself as cruelty directed at the person least able to push back against it. She said Ngozi had every reason not to help her. She said after everything, after 11 months of exactly what Ngozi had endured in this house, no one could have blamed her for walking past the study and saying nothing. She said she did not deserve what Ngozi had done. She said she was asking for forgiveness anyway because she needed to ask it even knowing she had not earned the right to receive it. Ngozi stood at the foot of the bed and listened. She felt the words go into the places where the hurt lived and she felt the hurt respond to them, not disappearing, because hurt that has been accumulating for 11 months does not disappear in a single conversation, but shifting. Making room. Opening slightly to allow something else in alongside it. She thought about what her mother had taught her about forgiveness, that forgiveness was not a gift given to the person who had caused harm. It was a gift given to yourself, the releasing of a weight you had been required to carry and were now choosing to put down not because the person who placed it on you deserved your relief but because you did. She said she forgave her. She said it quietly and completely and meant it in the way that things are meant when they have been thought through rather than simply performed. Sonia reached out her hand. Ngozi took it. They stayed like that for a moment, these two women, the distance between their worlds still enormous and real but the thing that had just happened between them real in a different and more immediate way. In the weeks that followed Emmanuel sat with Ngozi in his study and asked her the questions he had not asked in 11 months. He asked about her family in Akka. About her father the teacher and her mother the healer and her younger siblings and what they wanted for their lives. He listened with the specific attention of a man who has recently discovered that he had been failing to pay attention to something important and is correcting the failure seriously. He wrote a check that made Ngozi go still when she read it. He said it was for her family. For the school fees and the provisions and the margin that would make the monthly calculation slightly less impossible. He said it was because she had saved his wife and because he owed her a debt that money could only partially address but that he intended to address in every way available to him. He arranged evening classes. Business management. Accounting. Technology skills. He said that when she had completed what she needed to complete there would be a position in his company for her. A real position. He said she was sharp in a way that had been invisible in this house for 11 months because the house had been arranged to keep her invisible and he was ashamed of that and intended to make a different arrangement. Sonia's transformation was quieter and more gradual than the dramatic change of the illness itself, which is how real transformation usually works. The impossible standards did not all disappear at once. Some of her habits were too deeply set to uproot immediately. But the cruelty was gone in the specific way that cruelty is gone when the person producing it has understood something real about its cost. She started saying Ngozi's name differently. Not as a command but as the name of a specific person. She started asking questions rather than issuing instructions. She asked Ngozi once where she had learned to cook certain things and then listened to the answer for a long time. One evening Ngozi was in the kitchen preparing a soup from a recipe her mother had taught her, a recipe that used the same palm fruit and the same dried fish and the same careful sequencing of ingredients that her mother used every time she made it, which was the way recipes that live in people's hands rather than in books are always made, through the body's memory rather than the mind's instruction. Sonia came into the kitchen and stood beside her and looked at what she was doing. She asked what it was. Ngozi told her. Sonia asked if she would show her how to make it. Ngozi looked at her. Sonia said she had spent a very long time dismissing things she had not taken the time to understand and she thought it was past time to begin understanding some of them. They cooked together. Sonia chopped with the careful hands of someone who is learning something and is paying attention to the learning rather than performing competence. She made mistakes. She asked what she had done wrong and received the correction and tried again. She looked lighter than Ngozi had ever seen her look, less armored, less arranged, more present in her own body than she appeared to be when she was managing the performance of herself that the house usually required. She laughed once at something she did with the palm fruit that produced entirely the wrong result, and the laugh was genuine and unguarded and landed in the kitchen like something that had not been there before and changed the quality of the air. She said thank you while they were cooking. Not for the cooking specifically. For not letting me die, she said. Even after everything. Ngozi continued stirring. She said her madam would have done the same. Sonia was quiet for a moment. Then she said she did not think that was true. She said a few months ago she was not certain she would have chosen that. She said she hoped she was becoming a different kind of person. A person who would choose that. She said she was not there yet, but she was trying. That evening Emmanuel set the dining table for everyone. All of the household staff, all of them together at the long table that had only ever seated the family and their guests. Mrs. Fashola brought her rice. Ngozi brought the soup. Emmanuel poured drinks for everyone and made no speech about it, simply sat down and said let us eat. They ate together. The conversation moved across the table in the way that conversation moves when the people at the table have stopped performing their assigned roles and are simply being people, with stories about their families and their places and their lives, and the specific mixture of laughter and seriousness that happens when people who have been sharing a space finally share the space honestly. Ngozi sat at that table and thought about her mother. She thought about everything her mother had taught her about what it meant to carry knowledge that other people did not have the context to receive, and what it meant to use it anyway when the moment required it. She thought about the choice she had made in Emmanuel's study, the choice to speak when speaking was risky, to offer what she had even to the person who had spent 11 months making her feel like she had nothing worth offering. Her mother had said that the medicine did not know who deserved it. And what Ngozi had understood, sitting at this table in a city that had not been kind to her and looking at the faces of people who were slowly becoming more than their assigned positions in her experience, was that the medicine was not only the herbs and the ritual and the words in Igbo. The medicine was the choice itself. The choice to see a person's need clearly even when you have every reason not to. The choice to act on what you see even when acting costs you something. The choice to remain the kind of person who can be trusted with the knowledge you carry, regardless of who is watching, regardless of what has been done to you. That was the medicine. And it was working. Outside the window Lagos moved through its evening, the city continuing its enormous and indifferent business, the lights coming on across the rooftops one by one, the traffic finding its long slow route home, the air full of the particular sounds of a city that is always too much and always, somehow, exactly enough. Ngozi looked at the window and thought about Aka and thought about her mother and thought about the girl she had been when she arrived at this gate 11 months ago with one bag and a heart full of hope that the city had tested comprehensively and had not broken. She was still here. She was still that girl. She was also, quietly and without announcement, becoming someone else, someone larger than that girl, built from everything the city and this house and these people had required her to survive and choose and understand. The soup was good. The company around the table was better. And somewhere in Aka, in a small house with a provisions shop attached to the front of it, a woman who had taught her daughter to carry knowledge carefully and use it generously was going about her evening without knowing that her daughter had just done exactly that, in a mansion in Lagos, for a woman who had not deserved it, because that was what the knowledge was for. If this story reached you tonight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. Like this video and subscribe to Bishop Tales for powerful emotional stories every single week. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us this. When was the last time you offered something generous to someone who had not earned it? And what did it do to you? Tell us in the comments because those moments deserve to be spoken about. We will see you in the next story. Thank you for watching Bishop Tales.